Wolverine.
Awesome!
Hey everybody, welcome back to 16-Bit Superheroes, the series where we take a nostalgic look back at 16-bit games based on the most popular comic book and animated superheroes of the 90s. And today we're kicking things off with a game that on paper should have been an all-time classic, but in execution went over about as well as an adamantium claw to the face. And that is Wolverine Adamantium Rage on the SNES. As a kid, I was a massive fan of the X-Men, and in particular, I would read a lot of standalone Wolverine comics, which were always so awesome and featured some outstanding cover art. Keeping in mind, I'd never played or even heard of the NES Wolverine game when I first spotted Adamantium Rage on a rental shelf, I was delighted to see that the man himself got his own dedicated game, but that ended up being one of the most disappointing rentals of my entire life. I'll start with the positives though, which is that this game both looks and sounds pretty good, all things considered. The soundtrack has kind of a funky electronic drum and bass sound, and the visuals are fairly colorful and detailed, especially the cutscenes, which do a decent job of recreating the look of the comics, similar to how Maximum Carnage did with its cutscenes. It doesn't look as good as Mutant Apocalypse, but for what it's worth, Adamantium Rage is a decent looking game. Even the story, simple as it is pretty cool and features a ton of characters from the Wolverine comics. The negative aspects lie entirely with the gameplay, and you'd think this wouldn't be too hard to get right. I hate to sound like a broken record, but again, look at how Wolverine plays in Mutant Apocalypse. You kick the crap out of everything in sight, and you do a bit of platforming and wall scaling here and there, which is perfect. Here though, the controls are overly complicated, giving you buttons for 4 different attacks when all you really want is some claw action. Kicking, punching, and backhanding are totally unnecessary if you ask me. Also, just your basic movement is even kind of clunky and difficult to get the hang of, with Wolverine going into a full sprint whenever moving to the left or right and getting way too much hang time with his jumps. Plus, you get a mostly useless tuck and roll move by pressing up on the D-pad, which is easy to do by accident, and overall the janky controls make this game much harder than it really needs to be. Each stage requires you to destroy a certain number of a specific type of enemy before you can move on to a boss battle, and this gets annoying very quickly as you initially have no idea where the hell they are. And there's no indicator other than a number at the bottom of the screen to help you out. You also don't have any continues in this game, but you can take advantage of Wolverine's healing factor, which is a cool addition, but even that comes with a caveat in that if you're taking too long to complete a stage, the LCD timer will kick in, and when it reaches 0, it's game over. There is thankfully a password system included here, but it still would have been much better to throw us a bone and at least a couple of continues before seeing the game over screen. Bottom line, this game definitely had the potential to be something special, but what we ultimately got is an absolute slog to play. In short, Adamantium Rage sucks. Sorry Wolverine, you deserved much better.
I know how you feel about it, Wolverine, but...
Next up, we go from Adamantium Claws to the Cape Crusader with Batman Revenge of the Joker on the Sega Genesis, which itself is a port of the NES game Return of the Joker. And though it was developed by Sunsoft and released only about a year after their game based on the 1989 movie, and despite its title, this is not a sequel to that game, but is instead a standalone game that takes its inspiration more so from the comic books. The story centers around the Joker's plan to essentially blow up Gotham City using explosives he intends to make from toxic substances that he has somehow stolen from the mines on the outskirts of the city. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward bad guy has a WMD kind of story. It's not exactly Shakespeare, but it's all the motivation you need to suit up and kick some ass. The gameplay in Joker's Revenge is also fairly straightforward. It's your basic action platformer for the most part, with an emphasis on long-range attacks. Batman starts out with a pretty weak Batarang shot, but by collecting power-ups you can upgrade to 4 different, more powerful attacks, including homing Batarangs and a good old-fashioned spread shot. You can also hold the attack button to charge up a significantly more powerful charge shot a la Mega Man. And that too changes depending on what weapon you have equipped at the time. You also get a kick attack for when enemies get a little too close, and you can perform a slide by pressing down and the jump button. You can also collect power-ups to eventually grant yourself some temporary invulnerability, and we even get some side-scrolling shooter segments thrown in for good measure. Initially, I thought this game was pretty damn good. The controls are easy to get the hang of, the first couple of stages aren't too difficult, and the graphics and sound are pretty decent for the time it was released. Sunsoft Games always had great music after all, and because it's not based on the movie, Revenge of the Joker features character designs and cutscenes that are much more in line with what you'd see in a Batman comic. All good points in my book. The frustration really starts to kick in once you're a few levels deep, as this game eventually gets pretty damn difficult. You're a fairly large target, and there are sections where it feels like no matter what you do, there's really no way to avoid taking damage, and dying is especially frustrating, as it means you have to start again with your basic pea shooter. This is manageable in the middle of a stage, as you can always collect more power-ups, but against some of the later bosses, it basically means you're screwed, and might as well just start the stage over again. You have unlimited continues, and there's a very simple password system here, but you're still very likely to pull a few handfuls of hair out trying to get through this one. Overall, while it's far from being the best Batman game of this generation, Revenge of the Joker is still at least decent, albeit very difficult and at times very cheap. It could have been a lot better, but it could have been a lot worse.
I'm crazy enough to take on Batman, but the IRS, no, thank you.
Next, let's take a break from the Marvel and DC superheroes and look at something a little more obscure with The Tick on the SNES. The Tick was, of course, a Saturday morning cartoon on Fox Kids, but also had a decent run as a comic book, and all in all, it's a pretty funny series that lampoons a lot of the tropes commonly found in superhero comics. So with that in mind, I was interested in trying out the game, wondering what exactly the developers could do to convert the odd premise into something that's actually playable. The final result, though, is an absolute slog of a game to play. The Tick is pretty much just a straightforward side-scrolling beat-em-up, and it's not a particularly well-made one. The controls are very stiff and clunky, and as a result the difficulty is much higher than it really needs to be. There are a ton of enemies to contend with, and your moveset is very limited. Plus, there are also ill-conceived platforming stages to contend with in which projectiles are constantly flying at you from off-screen. The only kind of cool feature in the Tick is when you can occasionally team up with another hero from the show, such as Deflator Mouse or American Made, where they fight back to back, enabling you to attack enemies on both the left and the right. Also, when you're in a pinch, you can call in the Tick's trusty sidekick and roommate Arthur to quickly clear the screen. That's at least kind of cool, but it would have been better to just make a co-op beat-em-up and make those characters playable. Instead, this is a single-player only affair, and perhaps its greatest sin, this game is long. Yes, a brutally long beat-em-up. We're talking at least 3 to 4 hours to complete. And considering how lackluster the gameplay is, that's just inexcusable. Even the best beat-em-ups have enough sense to keep the game length down to about 45 minutes, which is perfect. But Turtles in Time or Streets of Rage, this certainly is not. On top of that, the graphics and sound both suck too, which again is very disappointing considering the source material. I can easily imagine a scenario where we got a decent beat-em-up based on the Tick that maintains the sense of humor of the cartoon and gave us a handful of fun characters to play as. Unfortunately, what we ultimately got was a game made with seemingly no real care. Just something that Software Creations, a studio that was capable of making a decent beat-em-up as evidenced in Maximum Carnage, just slapped together to make a quick buck on the license. If the tick had half a brain, I'm sure he'd be thoroughly ashamed.
He's faster than a tall building, larger than a speeding bullet. Eat my justice!
Okay, let's veer away from that really terrible beat-em-up and shift over to a pretty good beat-em-up, and that's the death and return of Superman on the SNES. As the name implies, the plot of this game follows the comics in which Superman is seemingly killed by the absolute wrecking machine that is Doomsday. And during his brief absence, several other characters attempt to take up the mantle of the Man of Steel. So while this game starts you off playing as Superman, you will also be playing as 4 other characters throughout the roughly hour and a half it takes to finish. And while the controls don't change from one character to the next, they do at least play a little differently from one another. If you've played any beat 'em up before, then you know what to expect here. Mostly just walk to the right and beat the hell out of any NPCs that wander on screen. You can punch them, throw them, slam them into the ground, the usual affair, but since you're playing as Superman, or Supermen, you do have access to a handful of superpowers. Obviously, Superman has an almost limitless number of abilities, so they're not all included, but you can use his heat vision as a stun attack, perform a powerful ground smash that wipes out regular enemies, and even do a bit of flying. In fact, there are several stages that ditch the beat-em-up gameplay altogether in favor of some side-scrolling shoot-em-up action. It's only after Superman is killed by Doomsday that you get to play as the other characters, and they include the decidedly insane cyborg Superman, who himself eventually becomes the game's antagonist, the Eradicator, an ancient AI that takes on the form of Superman and even believes itself to truly be Superman, though it doesn't share his aversion to killing. There's also Steel, yes, the same Steel that was famously portrayed by Shaq on the silver screen, a genius inventor that created a suit that can replicate the powers of the real Superman. And finally, you get to play as Superboy, a clone created from the DNA of Clark Kent and Lex Luthor, who goes by the name Connor Kent. As a half-human, half-Kryptonian, he possesses more or less the same powers as Superman, though they're not quite as potent. Getting to play as all of these characters is admittedly awesome, doubly so if you were a fan of the comics the game is based on. But again, I have to point out that games like this just aren't as fun when they're single player only. Imagine if you could tear through this game co-op, teaming up Steel and Superboy to take on Doomsday and the rest of the superpowered monsters wreaking havoc on Metropolis. That would indeed be epic, but instead we get a solo game which is faithful to the source material, but less fun as a result. The graphics are pretty damn good though, all things considered, and the sound design also isn't half bad. So while I wouldn't say it's among the best beat-em-ups on the SNES, the death and return of Superman is an above average effort. Definitely give it a playthrough if you haven't already.
Never seen Superman take such a pounding.
Finally, to wrap things up, since we started this video with a bad X-Men game, I think it's only right that we conclude with a good X-Men game, and that is the ever so awesome X-Men 2: The Clone Wars on the Sega Genesis. The first Genesis game based on Marvel's Mutants was pretty lackluster, with graphics, sound, and gameplay that all failed to impress, so at the time I can recall being tentatively excited for the sequel. I was a huge fan of the comics, and Mutant Apocalypse on the SNES had just melted my brain. So no matter what, I was going to give this game a try at my earliest convenience. The story was lifted straight from the comic books, and featured the X-Men taking on the extraterrestrial techno-organic hive mind known as the Phalanx. And no, not that Phalanx. This one is more like the Borg from Star Trek. They're enacting a plot to replace all life on Earth. So the X-Men team up with their longtime foe Magneto to put an end to the Phalanx's evil schemes. This is yet another action platformer, but it is miles beyond its predecessor. For starters, the graphics and sound have gone through a huge improvement. Much bigger and more detailed character sprites, more detailed environments, and a more robust color scheme, plus a soundtrack that doesn't sound like nails on a chalkboard, which is obviously a big step up. You start out with 6 playable characters, each with their own unique abilities and attributes intact, making each of them better suited for different areas of the game, and you can swap back and forth at your leisure. As I mentioned earlier, you also eventually gain Magneto as a playable character, and he is absolutely awesome with the power of flight and magnetic blasts. He's honestly kind of OP, but a lot of fun to play as, and better yet, there is no limit put on how much you can use your mutant powers, only that they become more potent when you're at max health. The core gameplay is solid and very fun, albeit very challenging in spots, but I don't think I'd want it any other way. And to cap things off, X-Men 2 also features co-op multiplayer, which is honestly a bit difficult to pull off in an intense action platformer like this, but its presence is appreciated. Again, I can't overstate just how much of an improvement this is over the first game, and when compared to something like Adamantium Rage, it's simply a masterpiece. If only this development team could have worked on a solo Wolverine game, oh what could have been. But between this and Mutant Apocalypse, 16-bit X-Men were totally redeemed and ended up becoming some of my favorite games from this generation of consoles. X-Men 2: The Clone Wars is a certified classic.
Maybe there's something to that wimpy teamwork garbage of yours after all. Wolverine. Wolverine.